And just like that, another baseball season sadly comes to an end. And let's be honest, for some of you, if you were never really a strong contender in your league throughout the year, it might just be time to face the fact your team sucked. Why? Let's talk about the top 5 reasons why your fantasy season might not have gone the way you wanted. Number one, you were all in on the Atlanta Braves. I honestly think this is the biggest thing that sunk teams. And look, I understand. Why wouldn't we be in on the team that was not only the best offense from the year before, had a loaded lineup from top to bottom, had arguably the best pitcher in the game? I mean, of course you're going to draft those guys early. And it turned out to be a mistake pretty much across the board. And this really goes much deeper than you even realize unless you're a Braves fan. Start with the obvious. The 1.1 in pretty much 99.9% of fantasy baseball leagues this year. And I only say that because, of course, there's going to be one guy in the comments who says, oh, I took Ohtani. Of course you did. Ronald Acuna. He had to be the number one pick. And even if he wasn't injured, let's face it, he was a bust until then. Yeah, that's right. I'll throw out the B word here. He was massively disappointing in the 49 games that he did play. Just recall, because I know it feels like ancient history at this point, maybe you were just trying to forget, the year before had that record-setting season along with his whole offense. He hit 337, which was good for second in the National League. He was hitting 250 at the time of his injury with only 4 home runs. He was on pace for a massively disappointing season, and then he got hurt and you were left with nothing. Sometimes you can recover from losing an early pick, maybe even your first round pick, but the first overall pick, the guy who was supposed to carry your team, and you might have even based the rest of your draft around it. It's just so hard to do. But that's really just the beginning. Let's keep going. Painful as it may be. Spencer Strider, yeah, the first pitcher taken in most drafts and a first round pick in a lot of leagues. He only lasted all of 2 games, and, just to throw some salt on the wound, in those 2 games, he wasn't even good either somehow. He gave up 7 runs in 9 innings pitched before having that UCL injury. And again, what hurts so much is the fact that if you took him, if you managed to get Strider, even with a second round pick, you probably waited on a starting pitcher for a while, or at least you didn't take as many because you had that guy, that ace. He was going to carry you in strikeouts alone. And so that impacts the rest of your roster. And then Matt Olson, look, I did warn a lot of you about this. He was on my preseason bust video. He sure picked it up a little bit toward the end of this year. So what? This guy was drafted 14th overall in terms of preseason ADP across all platforms. You knew he wasn't going to have another career year or even come close to matching it. At least I figured, not going to go for 50 plus home runs again. And he went barely to the 30 home run mark this year. And of course, the RBIs took a massive dip. And you really should have known the batting average was going to fall. This is a guy who's a career 254 hitter, and his batting average this year is pretty much in line with it. As of right now, about 246. Hitting 283 last year, it seemed like an anomaly, and it was. I'll say the guy I personally was the most disappointed was Ozzie Albies, usually a second round pick in a lot of leagues. And man, he did get hurt, sure, missed several weeks. That's not even it. I mean, that was almost a relief because you didn't have to worry about keeping him in your lineup anymore. Finished with 9 home runs, 8 steals, and that was in 380 at-bats, all of 94 games. Not even on pace for 2020. Albies tends to do this up and down throughout the years. Is next year going to be an up season? I don't know, but I don't think I'm willing to invest early in it. It's also very easy to kind of conveniently forget before Austin Riley got hurt, he was also a disappointment. Now, he did start to definitely pick things up in the second half of the season, but was he really worth drafting where he was taken? 33, 38, 37 home runs, 3 years in a row. This year, 19. Getting right around 100 RBIs every year. This year, 56. And then, of course, the batting average, only 256. And I think, again, the thing here that stings the most is the fact that this was an Iron Man, a guy who was playing almost every single game every year, who was always among the league leaders in games played, and only managed 110 this year. It just kind of shows exactly how this affected the entire team. It's like nobody, other somehow than Marcelo Zuna, was immune to it. Lesson learned for next year, I don't even think it's so much about the Braves specifically. I mean, the good thing is these guys will probably be cheaper in drafts next year, and so they might be reasonable. Maybe some of them are even going to be steals in draft if they fall far enough. But don't be all in on an offense and don't be surprised when even the team that looks so amazing in one year experiences the inevitable negative regression. I will say I don't think that's going to be a big problem because there really wasn't a juggernaut team this year, especially offensively. We usually have a couple of teams that are 100 plus win teams, and this year there just isn't one that stands out. Every team has had its struggles. Right now, it's the Arizona Diamondbacks that are going to be the league leader in terms of runs scored this season. I just don't see the first few rounds of fantasy drafts being loaded with D-backs players. I mean, are we really going to be all back in on Corbin Carroll even as a first rounder? So my final advice here is just any player, no matter how good they are, if they have what you think might be their career year or an offense that seems to just be clicking so well, don't be surprised if they don't do it the following year. Mistake number two that you might have made is just going all in on these rookies before they've even played. Look, I understand rookies are always valuable in fantasy, but maybe not in drafts. We had every reason to just assume that Jackson Holiday, Jackson Churio, Wyatt Langford, guys like this were going to be studs. And it didn't happen. In fact, some of the most valuable rookies turned out to be the guys who weren't the ones even considered on draft day. The one that stung me the most were those Rangers, specifically, actually not Langford, but Evan Carter. Now, I know, again, he missed so much time most of the season really with injury, but let's face it, that was after he had proven to be a big disappointment. He was hurting you, he got dropped in a lot of leagues, and then he got hurt. I mean, just didn't look ready. I thought this guy was going to be a breakout player this year. Seemed like he was absolutely MLB ready, and for some reason, April, he just wasn't. And even the guys who weren't bad this year, but Junior Caminero, if you stashed him and you're waiting and waiting and waiting for him to make an impact, you had to wait more than half the season, and it really wasn't worth it. And I know we're typically in the industry more careful with rookie pitchers, but and some guys wind up being wasted picks. Yuri Perez, of course, bad and then hurt. And then Kyle Harrison, just disappointing here. It was not worth drafting these players. But that leads me to mistake number three. Ironically, maybe you waited too long on some rookies. And I'm talking in season. So early on, we see some rookies who maybe we didn't have as high of expectations for. They start to do a little something, but we're not sure. Are they really going to get consistent playing time? Are they too young? Are they in the right situation? Are they going to keep it up? Well, in certain cases, the answer was yes, and you should have stayed patient and you should have been in on them before the breakout happened. I'm talking specifically about Jackson Merrill, guy who's either a late round flyer or not drafted at all, and in a lot of leagues, even after a strong first week, was then dropped by a lot of teams because then he started to go cold. I mean, sure, nobody thought he might wind up being the NL Rookie of the Year, but when you have that kind of talent, it's just worth taking a gamble on. Colton Cowser was on fire at the very beginning of the season and then dropped in a lot of places once he started to slump. And sure, he did have his struggles for a while and then he picked it back up. So again, you have to sometimes remain patient with these guys because the opportunity was always there. He kept getting consistent playing time in that loaded Orioles lineup. Same goes for Jordan Westberg. I couldn't believe after several weeks in the season, people just weren't in on him. He had a great season until he unfortunately got hurt. Same thing for a guy like Ceddanne Rafaela in Boston. And I'll even throw out a guy who technically was not a rookie, but almost Helio Ramos for the Giants. A lot of people were very skeptical, just didn't think he could keep it up, and he just kept hitting and kept hitting. I mean, look, the upside, the talent is there. That's what you're looking for. And then even towards the end of the season in the second half, some guys who just didn't really do much throughout the first half of the season, and then given a shot, they do start to do something. Talking about Pete Crow Armstrong, who besides all the steals, finally started to hit and produce as an RBI man. And then Connor Norby, once he got the chance in Miami, definitely helped some teams down the stretch. So again, you sometimes have to give a little bit of a leash to these rookies. And I'm always the first to advise on not going too far. As far as these rookie pitchers, they will always be so up and down. But man, when you get one that hits, it is worth it. So, what I always advise with rookies in general, especially top prospects, is take a chance. Pick them up, see what they do. If they don't work out, just drop them and move on and just keep taking those flyers because, again, these could be the guys who wind up helping you win your league. Now, obviously, we all knew about Paul Skeens, and it's easy to now look back and say, well, yeah, we all knew. But again, we didn't know when he was going to debut. We didn't know exactly how dominant he might be. we didn't really know. Come on, let's face it. So if you were one of those who did get ahead of the game, right? Always talk about beating the breakout. If you stashed Paul Skeens early enough, you're very happy. And then buying into those lesser known rookies who wind up being the ones who actually produce. I'm talking about Luis Gil. I mean, people, it took forever to finally come around and say, okay, I guess he's for real. Spencer Schwellenbach, first couple of starts were rough, and then he just was flat out dominant the rest of the way. Jared Jones, too. I mean, look, it's easy to say now, but at first, people were waiting to see if he was legit. And for at least the first half of the season, he was a big help. Now, speaking of pitchers, I think mistake number 4 that you might have made is you didn't try the streaming strategy. And this doesn't just apply to head-to-head weekly leagues. Now, of course, if you're in a weekly league, you look for those 2-start streamers. We always try to give you the best ones based on matchups, based on how things are going. But just streaming pitchers in general is so effective. And it's just so much better than rolling with a guy week after week, not sure what you're going to get from him. Throughout this past season, there were stretches where the following pitchers were almost unhittable and more valuable than a lot of near aces on teams. So guys like Ranger Suarez, remember when he was front runner for the Cy Young Award first half of the season? Tobias Myers was great. JP Sears had like a 7-game stretch where he was one of the best pitchers in baseball. Not kidding. David Peterson later in the season. Cody Bradford was really good in between those injuries. Trevor Williams, that's right, even Trevor Williams, way back at the beginning of the season, was a hot ad. And of course, throughout the second half, Bowden Francis, who we had all pretty much left for dead. And there are a lot of other pitchers who had shorter stretches of effectiveness. You know, guys like Luis Ortiz of Pittsburgh, Nick Martinez in Cincinnati. It could go on and on. But again, just getting those pitchers and picking up on those hot ads, being active is so important. I mean, I could just say not being active is the biggest mistake, but especially when it comes to streaming starting pitchers. And then mistake number 5, I really think this could apply to any baseball season again, but maybe you haven't been playing fantasy baseball too long. Maybe you just don't know. Maybe you think this year was an anomaly for closers. It wasn't. So it's always a mistake to trust closers. Out of the pitchers who wind up being top 10 in saves by the season's end, only 3 of them were actually drafted as top 10 closers. In other words, they pretty much lived up to their ADP and, good return on investment for value. That would be Emmanuel Class, who was definitely an exception here. He was just dominant. Josh Hader, eventually. Remember, he got off to a bad start too. And then Raisel Iglesias, one of the few Braves who paid off. Even guys you thought were the safest of the safe at reliever, Camilo Doval, David Bednar, Paul Sewald, even Craig Kimbrell. These guys all lost their jobs at one point. Kimbrell didn't even make it through the season in Baltimore. There really is no such thing as a safe closer. So, not saying you can't take one, early mid rounds if you really want, but one is the max. And just don't be shocked when the guy you thought was a lock for 20, 30 saves winds up being on the waiver wire eventually. And this, again, always comes back to the same thing. If you notice the common thread through all of these mistakes is you just constantly have to be active. So the final mistake would just be not keeping on top of things, making those waiver moves, streaming at any position that's relevant, and of course, active in the trade market. You have to stick with it throughout the entire season. That's the only way you can possibly win. We see so many first and second half splits that are drastic for certain players and positions and teams. It's almost like a new season. Again, if you stick with it, you're already winning half the battle. And I would just say this, if your team still looks an awful lot like it did after your draft by the time the season is over, and it's really not that different, then that's a big reason why you lost. And of course, it's a mistake to not keep up with the fantasy endgame. Going to start putting out draft content for next season. That's right. Why are we waiting here? Let's talk about who's going to be a first round pick, who are going to be the sleepers, who are going to be the breakouts. Going to start looking forward to the next fantasy season. It's a long off season, I know, but we're going to keep you informed. And if you are still playing fantasy football, hopefully you do, you want to check out, of course, the fantasy football endgame in season right now. This is the best time to be active on those fronts in terms of waiver wire trades and all that. So check out the channel and subscribe there if you haven't already.